The David Suzuki Foundation has released a new study on electrifying the economy after they surveyed a number of energy experts across the country. And there are very interesting insights into what kinds of power generation capacity we should be looking at. You know, should it be nuclear or large hydro or wind and solar? All sorts of issues raised in this study that Canadians really need to think about and talk about. So to discuss the study, we welcome Tom Green from the David Suzuki Foundation.
Thanks, Mark. I'm really glad to be on Energy Media. Thanks for the invitation.
Tom, this is a huge topic, and I know no doubt that you and I will be talking about this again in the near future. But start us off with a simple overview of the study.
All right. So this study is part of our larger Clean Power Pathways project, which is about how do we integrate renewables into our energy system so that we can bring our emissions down to zero by 2050 or sooner. So this report brings in together a number of different sources of information, including a survey of over 150 energy stakeholders. And it's and including some exercises, some polls, focus groups. And the idea is to offer insights for policymakers on how we can decarbonize and electrify the economy and the preferences of Canadians in getting there.
Now, you mentioned that in the study that renewable energy, so wind and solar primarily, but geothermal as well, are preferred by the experts over large hydro, like the Site C Dam in BC, or nuclear, whether it be large nuclear or the small modular reactors that have been in the news lately, that sort of thing. Now, that was very interesting. What is it about wind and solar and geothermal that lend themselves to this clean energy pathway in a better way than the other sources of power?
Yeah, thanks, Markham. One thing I should clarify too is that in some of these questions, the experts were answering not what they preferred, but what their perceptions of what Canadians would accept. So and this is people who have been going out implementing projects. So they're finding that Canadians are much more likely to support renewable distributed energy. And then the really big ones, the nuclear, new large hydro, and definitely fossil, even fossil with capture carbon and storage, are more difficult sells. And I think often that can be partly because there's a lot of stories about cost overruns with large hydro, like what we're seeing with Site C and Muskrat Falls. Nuclear is perceived as being very problematic. We still haven't solved the waste problem. And fossil fuels, carbon capture and storage, like with the Boundary Dam, we've seen that the costs can also be high. And people just perceive that solar and wind you can put up quickly, it's reliable, and it's, the costs have come down so markedly, and people are getting used to them.
Now, when we talk about wind and solar and distributed energy, are we talking about utility scale or rooftop solar, I guess?
Yeah, I think there's a whole range in there. We're not necessarily, what they're saying is that, yes, there is this, people love the idea of distributed solar, like the idea of being your own energy producer seems to be attractive to Canadians. But it's beyond that. There is a recognition that it's going to be, like, sometimes it'll be community scale solar. Lots of communities are seeing solar projects on their community centers, on their rinks, or feeding into it anyways. But there's it's a range. It's not.
Right. Last question, Tom. The work that I've done on this topic suggests that when you begin to electrify at the scale we're talking about, and in a lot of the provinces, you've got monopoly utilities like BC Hydro, and what you need is the kind of system that Alberta and Ontario have, where you have an independent system operator, and then you have a wholesale market, and that determines who gets to plug into the grid, basically. And that means a really significant change in utility models, in how we build things, how we regulate them. Do you think Canadians are ready for that conversation?
Well, Another thing our study shows is the energy stakeholders agree that there is a real need to improve Canadians' energy literacy. That, you know, we've got some really important questions as we move forward here, as we try and decarbonize and electrify the economy. And you're right, how the market structures, how producers can contribute to a grid or participate in a grid, how people can produce behind the meter, what credit they get for generating, tying into the grid as a battery. All these kind of things raise really important questions about structuring it in a way that gets the economic incentives right. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done for us to get to that level of energy literacy, and part of that has got to be about how do we set up our utilities so that it's the cleaner energy are the sources that are brought online, and yet in a way that's safe, affordable, you know.
Did the survey or the study that you did it have any insights into whether governments and regulators are prepared to have this conversation? Because I would say that, you know, looking out over the, you know, sort of surveying the landscape from the federal government, the various provincial governments, most jurisdictions are not ready for this. They're not even close to ready. Never mind the having made a decision on which models are best on a go-forward basis. They're not even ready to have the conversation about which models to use on a go-forward basis. Is that a fair observation on my part?
So some of our questions were open-ended, and you definitely saw that a number of the energy stakeholders were frustrated with questions about how we set up our market structures, utilities, to encourage a shift to renewables. So
Sure.
that, yeah, there's definitely frustration out there.
Right. So if nothing else, maybe this study will be part of the process of kicking off that conversation so that, you know, governments and regulators can wrap their heads around what's needed going forward and so on. So Tom, thank you very much. I think this is a very valuable study. I think we've only just scratched the surface on it. And yeah. I think we need to have a very large regional and national conversation about this particular topic. So good for you guys for doing this initial work.
Well, thank you. And that was definitely our reason for doing this study, is to help contribute to those conversations. Hence the name of the report, Talking Transitions. We really want to get people thinking about these issues and, you know, talking amongst different parties. So thanks very much for the opportunity to talk about the report.